Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes outside, blanketing the small, isolated mountain town of Hollow's End. It was New Year's Eve, and despite the treacherous weather, the townsfolk were determined to gather at the old community hall. Every year they celebrated together, ringing in the new year with laughter, music, and the promise of fresh starts. This year, however, something felt off. Marianne, a young woman with a knack for sensing things others couldn't, stood at the window of the hall, watching the swirling snow. She clutched her mug of spiked cider tightly, the warmth barely seeping through her chilled fingers. "You all right, Marianne?" asked Greg, the town's unofficial handyman and her childhood friend. Marianne turned to him, her eyes clouded with unease. "Doesn't it feel strange to you? The snow, the air? Something isn't right tonight." Greg laughed, though it lacked its usual warmth. "You've been watching too many horror movies. It's just a snowstorm. We're all inside, safe and sound." But Marianne couldn't shake the feeling that they were anything but safe. The hall buzzed with the noise of cheerful chatter and clinking glasses as the townsfolk mingled. Paper streamers and balloons hung limply in the warm, humid air of the packed space. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, counting down the hours until midnight. Just as Marianne was about to push her unease aside and join the festivities, the lights flickered. For a moment, the hall was plunged into complete darkness, eliciting gasps and nervous laughter. When the lights returned, they were dimmer, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "Probably the storm," Greg said, though his brow was furrowed as he glanced at the overhead lights. A loud bang echoed through the hall, causing everyone to jump. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room had slammed shut, though no one had been near them. The room fell silent, the jovial atmosphere replaced by a tense unease. "Must be the wind," someone offered, their voice trembling. Marianne's eyes darted to the windows. The snow was still falling, but it seemed darker now, almost black against the dim light. She felt her heart race as she noticed something, or someone, standing just outside the glass, barely visible through the swirling snow. "Greg," she whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Look." He followed her gaze and froze. A figure stood in the snow, motionless, its features obscured by the storm. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its outline was jagged, like broken branches. "Who the hell is that?" Greg muttered, his voice low. Before Marianne could respond, the figure moved. It took a step forward, then another, each movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. The sound of its steps, even muffled by the snow, seemed to echo inside the hall, louder than it should have been. "Lock the doors," someone shouted, breaking the spell of silence. Greg and a few others rushed to bar the doors, though Marianne doubted it would do any good. The figure was gone, vanished into the storm, but the sense of dread it had brought lingered. The partygoers huddled together, their earlier merriment forgotten. The clock ticked on, its sound now a cruel reminder of the passing time. Midnight was approaching, and with it came an unshakable feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The lights flickered again, and this time when they came back, the room was plunged into an unnatural cold. Frost crept up the windows from the inside, and the breath of everyone present turned to mist. The candles that had been lit for ambience sputtered and went out, leaving only the weak overhead lights to cast their unsettling glow. Then the whispers began. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was malevolent, filled with malice and hunger. "Who's there?" Greg called out, his voice wavering. The whispers didn't answer, but they grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony that set everyone's teeth on edge. Some of the townsfolk clamped their hands over their ears. Others began to cry. Marianne stood frozen, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows on the walls were moving again, but now they were more defined, more purposeful. They weren't just shadows. They were shapes, figures, twisted and grotesque. One of them detached from the wall and slithered across the floor, moving toward a young boy clutching his mother's hand. Mary Ann screamed, breaking the paralysis that had held her in place. She grabbed a chair and swung it at the shadow, but it passed through, dissipating like smoke before reforming behind her. "We have to get out of here," she yelled, but the doors wouldn't budge. They were sealed tight, as if by some unseen force. The clock struck 11:30. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow worse. Then the figure appeared again, this time inside the hall. It stood at the back of the room, its jagged form illuminated by the dim light. Its face, if it had one, was a void, a swirling abyss that seemed to suck in the light around it. It raised a hand, long and clawed, and pointed at the clock. The meaning was clear. It was counting down to midnight. Panic erupted. People screamed and pounded on the doors, desperate to escape. The shadows on the walls grew bolder, reaching out with inky tendrils to ensnare the fleeing partygoers. One by one, they were pulled into the darkness, their screams cut short as they vanished without a trace. Mary Ann and Greg managed to avoid the grasping shadows, huddling together near the center of the room. "What do we do?" Greg whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," Mary Ann admitted. She glanced at the figure, which hadn't moved but seemed to be watching them. "But we can't let it reach midnight. Whatever happens then, it'll be worse than this." Desperation fueled her courage. Mary Ann grabbed a lantern from one of the tables and hurled it at the figure. It shattered against its form, the flames briefly illuminating its true nature. For a split second they saw it clearly. A mass of writhing, clawing shapes, human and inhuman, all twisted together in eternal torment. The creature let out a sound, not a scream, but a vibration that shook the very air. The shadows recoiled and the clock's hands slowed, as if struggling against time itself. "It's working!" Greg shouted. "We have to destroy the clock!" Mary Ann hesitated. The clock had always been a fixture of the town, a piece of its history. But as she looked at the figure and the horrors unfolding around her, she knew Greg was right. The clock was the key. They fought their way through the chaos, dodging shadows and pulling others free when they could. By the time they reached the clock, only a handful of people remained. The others were gone, consumed by the darkness. "Help me!" Greg yelled, grabbing a heavy candlestick and swinging it at the clock face. Mary Ann joined him, using a chair to smash at the wooden glass. With each blow, the figure screamed, its form flickering and weakening. The clock struck 11:59. The second hand ticked forward, agonizingly slow. Mary Ann swung with all her strength, shattering the inner mechanisms. The clock groaned, its chimes warping into a horrific wail. The figure lunged toward them, its form dissolving into a storm of black tendrils. Mary Ann braced for impact, but just as it reached them, the clock stopped. The hands froze at 1 second to midnight. The room was silent. The shadows retreated, melting away into nothingness. The frost on the windows disappeared, and the warmth of the hall returned. The figure was gone. Mary Ann and Greg collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Around them, the few survivors looked shell-shocked, their eyes wide with terror. "Is it over?" Greg asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary Ann didn't answer. She stared at the broken clock, its face cracked and its hands unmoving. Something about it still felt wrong, as if the battle wasn't truly won. As the survivors helped each other to their feet and began to assess the damage, Mary Ann glanced out the window. The snow had stopped, but the night was still unnaturally dark. In the distance, just beyond the edge of town, she thought she saw a flicker of movement. A shadow, long and jagged, slipping silently into the forest. The new year had begun, but Mary Ann knew their nightmare was far from over.